Welcome you all to the second session titled Ethics, Aesthetics and Political Philosophy of this Kant conference. We are honored to have Professor Nirmalangshu Mukherji as chair for this session, as well as our distinguished speakers, Professor Udaya Kumar, Professor Andrew Shignell, Professor Arindam Chakrabarti and Professor Gunter Zoller, who will be joining us online. I respectfully invite the esteemed panel onto the dais to share their valuable insights. Professor Nirmalangshu Mukherji is a former professor at the Department of Philosophy, University of Delhi, and former national professor at the Indian Council of Philosophical Research. His research includes valuable work on the philosophy of mind and the philosophy of language, along with their intersection with linguistics, specifically biolinguistics. His work includes important books titled The Primacy of Grammar and The Human Mind Through the Lens of Language. Professor Udaya Kumar is a former professor at the Center for English Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, as well as former professor at the Department of English at the University of Delhi. His publications include two books entitled Writing the First Person, Literature, History and Autobiography in Modern Kerala, and The Joycean Labyrinth, Repetition, Time and Tradition in the Ulysses. His recent research has focused on death and contemporary culture, forms of life writing, cultural histories of the body, and idioms of vernacular social thought. Please, sir. Oh, he's there, sorry. Professor Andrew Shignell is a Lawrence S. Rockefeller Professor in the University Center for Human Values at Princeton University, with appointments in the Religion and Philosophy departments. He served as the president of the North American Kant Society between 2020 and 2023. He has written extensively on hitherto unexplored dimension of Kant's philosophy, with a special focus on theorizing hope and despair in their connection with Kantian morality. Please. Professor Arindam Chakrabarti is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Ashoka University. His work has tried to blend analytic, continental and classical Indian philosophies, particularly Nyaya and Buddhist philosophy. His recent book, Realisms Interlinked, Objects, Subjects and Other Subjects, continues in this vein and provides a valuable exposition of metaphysical realism, drawing from both the Nyaya and analytic tradition, in an exemplary example of what commentators have called cross-cultural philosophy. Professor Gunter Zoller is an emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Munich. His research focuses on German idealism and political philosophy, extending across the German tradition, including work on Kant, Fichte and Hegel. Thank you all for joining us today. We would like to begin by felicitating our guests. I now hand over to our chairperson, Professor Mukherji, to begin the session.
Wow. Good.
I would now like to invite our chairperson, Professor Mukherji, to begin the session.
Welcome everyone. We have a session title what's the session title? Because Professor Mitra has come up with interesting titles for each session. I want to announce that title. Where is that title? Ethics and Politics. Okay. That's interesting. Ethics, Aesthetics and Politics, the other Kant. So that's the idea. And we have four very distinguished speakers here, three here, right there, and one online. So that's a very busy session and we don't have much time because I think we should finish exactly in time so that there are still some people left to listen to our research students. Okay, which follows that session of research students follows after this session, after these 4 lectures. So there should be some audience for that. So I will be very, very strict about time. All right? Okay, we will break for lunch after the first talk, and then I will be very strict about time, and may not allow questions if the speakers go over time, because I want to keep the time for the students at the end very much. Thank you very much. So we begin with the first talk. I think that's Professor Udaya Kumar, is the first speaker.
Yeah.
Okay. So please, Udaya Kumar, your topic is Kant on the Sublime, Critique, Anthropology, and the Aesthetics, just like Udaya Kumar. I think you have half an hour, 30 minutes. 30 minutes, okay?
25 minutes, will you give me a shout?
I will try.
I'm first of all, my apologies for keeping you away from lunch. And let me begin by thanking Enakshi Mitro and colleagues at the Philosophy Department of Delhi University for inviting me for this important conference. It's a pleasure to be back to speak in this building after more than 10 years. And to see several friends here. But I must also confess my sense of nervousness, which I shared with Enakshi when she first invited me and then persuaded me to be part of it. As you know, I'm not really a philosopher, I'm an interloper here, really. And my own reading of Kant is very sketchy and partial. It's not at all comprehensive, or it's not at all rigorous. Like many literature students or students of literary and cultural studies, I have been interested in some writings of Kant and some discussion ideas in Kant, which became very important for literary studies at certain points in time. And this writing on the question of the sublime really came out of that, and my initial kind of engagement with it was many years ago. And now when I read these texts again, I'm not sure I understand them better. So often I find that I find them even more complex and even more difficult. So I just wanted to say these things by way of a caveat about the limitations of my paper. I'll take a second to get my bottle of water.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, as you know, for students of literature especially, the key text of Kant, which people tend to read, is the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, which, as you know, is only one part of the critique of the power of judgment, and the second part is often not really read in literary studies context, which is unfortunate, because to understand what Kant is trying to do in the Critique of Aesthetic Judgment, we also need to see what happens in the critique of teleological judgment. And the sublime, the discussion of the sublime, is a peculiar kind of moment in the critique of aesthetic judgment, because you could say that, as my friend Jacob was pointing out a few moments ago, on the one hand it looks like a shorter discussion compared to the beautiful, after having set up the beautiful. But on the other hand, it seems to be the pivot on which the critique and the arguments in the critique actually turn. And something goes away from the plans. It begins as something about natural beauty, about the idea of the beautiful. And then after the sublime, things change, and you get the notion of the aesthetic idea. You begin to get talk about art. A whole range of things begin to happen there. Now, Kant, as we know, when he was writing the Critique of Judgment Power, he was engaging very closely with two different traditions of thinking about judgment. One was the German tradition. Christian Wolff's name has been invoked many times already. And the second was the kind of British tradition, which is the Scottish Enlightenment, and also people like Hume. And in relation to the sublime, of course, the key predecessor of Kant the most famous text, so to say, was Edmund Burke's old 1757 text called A Philosophical Inquiry into the Originals of Our Ideas of the Sublime and the Beautiful. Now, Kant's engagement with the sublime goes back a long way. You will see that it actually comes up very early in this early text called Universal Natural History and the Theory of the Heavens, which is very early. And the concluding concluding paragraph of that text, I'll just read it out because I'm also trying to follow one particular motif which comes up repeatedly in Kant's writing on the sublime. So this concluding para of the Universal Natural History and the Theory of the Heavens goes, indeed, when one has filled one's mind with such observations and with the preceding ones, the view of the starry sky on a clear night gives one a kind of pleasure that only noble souls feel. In the universal stillness of nature and the calmness of the senses, the immortal spirit's hidden faculty of cognition speaks an ineffable language and provides undeveloped concepts that can certainly be felt but not described. Question of speakability, that Mali was speaking about. If among the thinking creatures of this planet there are any despicable beings who, in spite of all the delights with which so great an object can attract them, are yet in a position to tie themselves firmly to the service of vanity, how unfortunate is the sphere that has been able to bring up such miserable creatures. But how fortunate is it, on the other hand, because under the most acceptable conditions, a way has been opened for it to attain bliss and sublimity that is exalted infinitely, far above the benefits that the most advantageous arrangement of nature can attain in all celestial bodies. The image of the starry sky, we are all familiar with that, of course, from the conclusion of the Critique of Practical Reason, where Kant says, two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and reverence, the more often and more steadily one reflects on them: the starry sky above me and the moral law within me. But it's also interesting that Kant very quickly moves on in this concluding paragraph of the first book, The Universal Natural History, from invoking this feeling of sublimity while contemplating the starry sky to a criticism of people who cannot feel it. Very quickly he moves on from this to differentiate between two different kinds of people. One set who are responsive to it, who are moved by this noble feeling, and another who are tied to vanity and who cannot, etc., etc. Now, the distinction between people who are sensitive to this experience and who are not becomes important here. Now, this differentiation is what you may call an empirical differentiation. Yeah? This is a matter for anthropology. Anthropology is a site where the sublime and the beautiful were explored before Kant addressed them in critical philosophy. In 1764, Kant wrote a text called Observations on the Feeling of the Beautiful and the Sublime. And his preoccupation with anthropology predated the critical project and also survived the critical project. Lectures on physical geography and anthropology, which he regularly delivered, apparently, apart from the lectures on logic, those were the most numerous lectures that he gave. The former from 1756 for a period of 40 years. Anthropology for 25 years from 1772 to 1796. And the publication from Anthropology from a pragmatic point of view is in 1798, as late as that. Now, in his lectures on logic, there is one note, one passage which comes up in 1800. he says, the field of philosophy in this sense may be reduced to the following questions. What can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope? What is man? The first question is answered by metaphysics, the second by morals, the third by religion, and the fourth by anthropology. In reality, however, all these might be reckoned under anthropology, since the first three questions refer to the last. Now, bringing anthropology into the discussion of the sublime raises indirectly the question of the relationship between the anthropological project and the critical project in Kant. I won't have time to go into that, but making a quick remark that it has been pointed out by some scholars that the anthropological self-observation has the characteristic of reaching neither the subject in itself nor the pure eye of synthesis, but a self which is object and present only in its phenomenal truth. Yet this object eye, which is given to the sense in the form of time, is nevertheless not alien to the determining subject, since in the end it is nothing but the subject as it is affected by itself. So just to connect it with some of the discussions we had in the morning session, the anthropological figure of the eye, in that sense, you could say that there is a place, it's what Foucault in Order of Things would call a empirico-transcendental conjunction, a doublet, where both these things actually come into play there. Now, about Sublime, we all know that Sublime was a major theme in 18th century British thought. And it goes back to, and interestingly, the idea of the Sublime really becomes active after Longinus' text on the lofty style gets translated into English. And it moves from the idea of rhetoric to the idea of sentiment, inner experience, etc. And it goes back to people like Addison, some of the early writings on the Sublime, and then, of course, Burke's major text, which comes out in 1757. And Burke actually begins by speaking about two distinct kinds of pleasure which we experience. One is, of course, what he calls beautiful, which is an unproblematic idea of pleasure. And the other is the sublime, where it is mixed with some kind of pain, which is also related to the idea of fear. And still it is something which you enjoy. So a kind of classification between two different experiences of pleasure. After having established these two different experiences, which he also connects with another distinction, which is between the egotistical emotion of fear and the altruistic emotion of love. Yeah? After this, Burke's text is actually an attempt to enumerate or detail instances of the sublime and the beautiful. You could say that he is concerned with the question of what are the appropriate objects which can provoke these experiences. So there are a large number of things. We don't have the time to go into that. And sometimes Burke's explanations have a kind of, what you may call a kind of psychophysiological kind of texture about it. Like obscurity is sublime, and it is related to the dilation of the pupil, etc., etc. Yeah? And also the relaxation of the muscles, the smoothness of the neck, a number of things which are related to bodily experience becomes important there. Now, Kant's treatment of the sublime in both texts is different, but by the time he comes to the critique of judgment, he would actually directly comment on Burke and to saying that this is actually like the raw materials for a system. You have accumulated all kinds of instances, but you are not actually critically examining them to find out what the sublime is. What are the conditions of the possibility of the judgment of the sublime? But even when he does observations in 1764, Kant's interest is not so much in the objects that provoke the sublime. It is rather in the kind of people, the kind of individuals or subjects, who would experience sublimity and who would experience beauty. Now, it's interesting to notice that this is a taxonomy of different kinds of people, different kinds of classifying humankind into different types and based on different criteria to explain the preference for the sublime or the openness to the sublime and the openness to the beautiful. There are two ideas which come up as very important. One is the notion of temperament. Now, you know that temperament is a very important idea in Kant's anthropology. And the second is the idea of disposition. Disposition, again, is something which is not really a rational kind of feature. It is something which orients you, disposes you to certain kinds of experiences. So he tries to classify or distinguish between different dispositions and temperaments which determine if somebody is open to the idea of the sublime or prefers the beautiful. Now, this, of course, is preceded by a synoptic description, like in Burke, between some examples of objects of the sublime and objects of the beautiful. I'll read just two sentences to show you how quickly and seamlessly it moves from speaking about the objects of the experience of the sublime to the kind of people who are actually experiencing them. Tall oaks and lonely shadows on a sacred grove are sublime. Flower beds, low hedges, and trees trimmed in figures are beautiful. Night is sublime, day is beautiful. The sublime moves, the beautiful charms. The mien of a man undergoing the full feeling of sublime is earnest, sometimes rigid and astonished. On the other hand, the lively sensation of the beautiful proclaims itself through shining cheerfulness in the eyes, through smiling features, and often through audible mirth. He also classifies different experiences of the sublime, different kinds of sublime, as terrifying, noble, and splendid. From this, you will see that in the observations he derives a number of concepts is too strong a word, a set of phrases and words through which we ordinarily understand people's responses. Like, for example, grotesquerie, visionary behavior, adventure, and then words like the fob, the crank, the pedant, etc., etc. Yeah. And as you can see, this is part of what can be broadly called an anthropological approach. Now, from this initial discussion, Kant moves on to speak about humors and trying to understand them in relationship to temperaments, in relationship to beautiful and the sublime. Like the melancholic is seen as more open to sublime. And then he moves on to gender. Here, he, in some sense, rehearses something which you already find in Burke, that is, man is sublime and the woman is actually beautiful. And in Burke, Mary Wollstonecraft had written a very powerful criticism of this distinction. Now, but Kant does not stop with the question of gender. He moves on to nations. Here, statements like Italians and French are beautiful, open to the experience of the beautiful. The Germans, the English, and Spanish are more open to the experience of the sublime. And then he expands beyond Europe, but using Europe as a kind of template. He would say that the Arabs are the noblest men in the Orient. They are a bit like, the Italians, etc., etc. So a series of, as you know, maybe Kant was already at this young age, he was reading a lot of travel writing. And travel writing is this major source for the lectures in anthropology. Now, the culmination of this tendency of taxonomy is found in Kant's use of a kind of racial distinction. The last part of the observations is really about the different races. So there he takes the distinction between the white and the black races as the fundamental opposition. So fundamental is the difference between these two races of man, and it appears as great in regard to mental capacities as in color. Now, there are some more recent thinkers like Robert Bernasconi, probably writing in the 90s or early 2000s, who wrote this essay called Who Invented the Concept of Race? And he makes this argument that Kant was very central to the invention of a philosophical concept of race, which underlies a modern racialist thinking. Like, the crucial point he makes in that essay is that the connection established between physical features and physiognomic features on the one hand, and mental capacities, attitudes, dispositions, talents, this comes up in the observations to begin with, but it also comes up in other essays like On the Diversity of Human Races, which is written in the 1770s. And now we have part of the anthropology lectures available in English, so we have numerous examples of remarks of this kind coming up there. So for Kant, the blacks of Africa have no feelings that rise above the trifling. Moreover, they are very vain and so talkative, I'm quoting, okay, talkative, that they must be driven apart from each other with thrashings. After citing an observation by a black man on the relationship between the sexes among the whites, Kant observes, and it might be that there was something in this which perhaps deserved to be considered. But in short, this fellow was quite black from head to foot, a clear proof that what he said was quite stupid. Now, this idea of stupidity becomes important in discussions of races. Now, my interest in citing these passages is not to score a political point against Kant, but to see this anthropological impulse in his thinking and how it shapes the thinking about the aesthetic, thinking about the sublime, etc., etc. Now, the anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, probably the last published text, 1798, in that there is a second part called anthropological characterization, which aims to specify how to discern man's inner self from his exterior. The argument is developed in 4 moments here, expanding, you could say, centrifugally. They address respectively the character of the person, sexes, nations, races, and species. There are marked similarities between this and the arguments on dispositions that we encountered in observations. However, Kant's discussion of racial character in this text is striking in its brevity. In the 2 paragraphs devoted to this section, Kant merely points out that within each race, nature's law aims not to let the characters of its people constantly approach one another in likeness. This is the main point he tries to make there. Now, we know that the discussion we find in the third critique is very different from the kind of things which I outlined so far. It's universal in scope, and as we know, the third critique, in some sense, is actually bringing together what Kant tried to do in the first critique and what he did in the second critique. And the question it implicitly responds to is, how can human beings inhabit the world of nature as free subjects, as moral beings? So there, the idea of purposiveness, as all of us know, becomes absolutely important. Recently, there has been some work on how far does this thinking about the teleological orientation for thinking about the sublime go back in Kant. There are some people who have argued that it actually comes quite late. It really is the third critique which does it. But recently, there have been scholars who have argued that you can find traces of this quite early. In terms of sentiments, in terms of the idea of the orientation to a moral feeling, it has certainly a very long history in Kant. Now, so then, like what I said earlier, the third critique begins by talking about natural beauty. Unlike Hegel, you don't get much discussion of works of art in Kant. Not only that, natural beauty is seen as superior in the beginning of the third critique in comparison to artistic beauty or man-made beauty, so to say. This probably changes in the course of the third critique, although it's not directly asserted. And purposiveness, the sense of purposiveness that you feel when you look at nature, that is seen as already indicating a moral inclination. Gilles Deleuze correctly pointed out that the man who goes out for a walk in the forest, for Kant, shows signs of a moral inclination more clearly than the one who goes to visit museums.
Yeah.
Yeah. Now, I want to, we don't have much time. So
I will let you know. I will let you know.
Yeah.
Carry on, carry on.
So anyway, I won't have too much to say. See, we know that the key argument about the Sublime that the third critique makes is that the Sublime is actually contrafinal. Like it actually, there is a kind of conflict which happens in the experience of the Sublime. Like on the one hand, you're confronted with an image, a representation, which seems to, which is difficult to comprehend. Like in the mathematical Sublime, it really becomes one of comprehending. And in the dynamic Sublime, something which is difficult to come to terms with. It seems to be too big, too powerful, etc. So the imagination in trying to produce an image of this, at some point, is interrupted by reason, which supplies a pure idea of reason, such as infinity. And once reason supplies this idea, imagination tries to match it with a representation. Yeah? So imagination pulls itself out of its limits and tries to reach it, and it keeps failing. So it is in this failure, in this falling back, that you get the experience of the Sublime. Yeah? So this is a typical gesture in Kant. On the one hand, this sense of humility, it actually shows you how small you are in front of this vast universe. But on the other hand, it also shows you your superiority in relation to nature, because you have the rational idea of infinity to which nothing in nature can match up. Yeah? So this is actually the key element in the Sublime. Now, since I have only about 4 minutes, I will just focus on one moment in the third critique, and an interesting set of comments made by an eminent literary thinker, Paul Deman, on that. This is the famous passage about, again, the starry sky, which we spoke about earlier. This is from the third critique. I quote from Kant, "So if we call the sight of the starry heaven sublime, we must not found our estimate of it upon any concepts of worlds inhabited by rational beings, with bright spots which we see filling the space above us, as their suns moving on orbits prescribed for them with the wisest regard to ends. But we must take it just as it strikes the eye, as a broad and all-embracing canopy, and it is merely under such a representation that we may posit the sublimity which the pure aesthetic judgment attributes to this object." One more short paragraph, it follows on. "Similarly, as to the prospect of the ocean is the other example, we are to regard it as we, with our minds stored with knowledge on a variety of matters, are wont to represent it in thought, as, let us say, a spacious realm of aquatic creatures, or as the mighty reservoirs from which are drawn the vapors that fill the air or the clouds of moisture, etc., etc. If we do this, we get nothing beyond teleological judgments. Instead of this, we must be able to see sublimity in the ocean, regarding it as the poets do, according to what the impression on the eye reveals, as, let us say, in its calm, a clear mirror of water bounded by the heavens, or be it disturbed as threatening to overwhelm and engulf everything." Now, these are interesting for two reasons. One is you don't get that image of fear here. Now, the fear is it's stillness, the kind of stillness which we invoked in the universal history essay earlier. And the second thing is that here there is an evacuation of concepts, a denudation of representation of all concepts in order for this experience of the sublime to arise. Now, Paul Deman, now I'll just summarize. Paul Deman wrote a very interesting set of essays on Kant, one of which is called Phenomenality and Materiality in Kant, if I remember right. And in that he makes this point that these fascinating passages may be juxtaposed to a passage from the Lectures on Logic, where Kant speaks about man in the wild who is unaware of houses, if he sees a house, he will not really see it the way in which a person who is familiar with houses would see it. Kant says there that in the case of the man in the wild, there is only intuition. In the other case, there is intuition and concept. So, but what the man is trying to tell us is that the perception of the man in the wild, which is devoid of concepts, seems to be strangely have some kind of kinship. It seems to resonate with what the poet does when he looks at the ocean, or how the starry sky strikes the eye without striking the mind. Yeah? Now, this is a problematic thing because we know that the figure of the savage appears in the third critique as somebody who cannot have an experience of the sublime. Because a savage who looks at a turbulent ocean would only be frightened of it. He will not be able to have the experience of the sublime. So there is an interesting complication in the figure who is outside the ambit of culture, the human being who is outside the ambit of culture, which comes up here. Now, it's a question, it's an open question as to how to think further with this. One of the ways in which one may think about it is that in Kant's thinking, Kant stands at a kind of very important point where two things are happening, which we associate with the Enlightenment. On the one hand, we have the claims about the universal idea of the human subject as a free subject, etc. On the other hand, you also have the differentiation of the human race into people who are more cultured and less cultured, more human, less human, etc., etc. These give rise to two different aspects of the Enlightenment, as we know. One leading to modern forms of governance and state on the one hand, and the other to the entire history of thinking universality. But there is also one more issue there. Is it at all possible to think about the savage as not below the threshold of this encounter with the sublime?
Time's up, I know.
Yeah. In Kant's third critique, I'm just winding up. In Kant's third critique, there are some moments which have a kind of possibility there. This happens, this is really undeveloped, not only in the third critique, but even in the early lectures. This comes up in the discussion of sensations and effects. Like, for example, Kant speaks about the savage as capable of admiration of courage. Yeah, I'm stopping. And also, similarly, the savage as somebody who has intensities of sensations. And some sensations are associated more with the experience of the sublime, like shudder as different from tremor. So there might be a possibility where it's a question, I'm not suggesting that there is a possibility, but is there a possibility of thinking about this orientation to the sublime at a threshold which is below the level of ideas of reason, and to a more elementary threshold of the human being inhabiting a large universe in which it finds itself in a state of stillness. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Very good. It's a very elegant and very well thought out paper. Provocative, I would say. He claims that it's not political, but I think it's very political. So, we don't have much time, so very few questions. So maybe if someone is interested. I myself had many questions. Please go ahead. Please come to the mic.
Udaya, last book, Conflict of Faculty.
Yes, Conflict of Faculty. Yeah.
Am I audible? Yes.
Yeah.
So, you talked about the sensitivities of, somehow discerning the sublime, discerning the beautiful in different people. And that made me think about how do we cultivate this discernment or this quality in us. And therein I find a certain paradox, because at least in the third critique, these things are a result of a failure of faculties. Right? even in Sublime, there is a failure which invites reason to intervene. If that happens, how do we learn anything? Because let's say I see an ocean and I'm in awe of the ocean. Nevertheless, if I learn more about the ocean, how oceans are created, what are the geological processes in the history of geology that has created the ocean, my understanding is becoming better and better. Nevertheless, I am less and less prone to feeling that awe, right? So is cultivation even possible? Because cultivation to me then becomes unlearning what you have learned, and there is no pedagogy to it, right?
Cultivation versus anthropology.
Should we take the other question as well? There is
No, you can take this. This is a very good question.
Yeah.
Why?
Yeah, thank you for that. See, there is an interesting question about the ability to appreciate beauty or the sublime as belonging to culture. In Kant, there is a concept of culture. Third critique has a discussion of culture. But it's not as if these originate in culture. Kant is clear about it. These do not originate in culture and are taught to you in some kind of a conventional way. If I remember the sentence, it's something like that. It is a natural capacity that being human involves. The different faculties, the possibility of this tension, and the opening, the failure, that for Kant is really the success of the human subject. The ability to open the door to infinity, let the reason come in. Now, learning a lot about if you become a marine engineer, for example, it is only by suspending the view that the sea is full of aquatic creatures, etc., that you will be able to see it like the poet sees it. And that is the gate which opens, so the window which opens to the moral dimension. It is not that knowledge of facts and cognitive knowledge which would actually give you that. Well, in Kant, see, he has maybe, I do not know if there is a single answer to that. One is there is a certain relationship to nature becomes important. A certain relationship to form becomes important. A sensibility to form. After all, what is it to see an ocean like a mirror? The mirror is mentioned there because there is a complete lack of depth. It's a pure surface. That is what he is trying to get at. So in that sense, an ability for form, it is only by familiarizing yourself with it. It is not something which can be taught in the way in which you can be taught information. Yeah. Sure.
I will, well, just one more. Go ahead. Please give her the mic. You want to take Vaishali? She used to be.
Thank you so much, sir. It was really a thought-provoking lecture. So my question is, as you mentioned about Edmund Burke's, the work on Beautiful and Sublime, that he talks about the instantiations, the examples of beautiful and the examples of sublime. So it is more object-oriented, but in the case of Kant, he is more subject-oriented. So can we say that, and you also mentioned about how imagination fails in the case of sublime experiences and the reason have to come in. But if the subject, because it is subject-oriented, if the subject synthesizes the manifold of the experiences in such a way that the same event can be sublime to one person and can be beautiful to the other person.
I think done.
Yeah, thank you. The important thing as we are dealing with what is called reflexive judgment in these cases, isn't it? Like we are not actually speaking about subsumptive judgment, where a concept actually can be given. But it's entirely possible to imagine somebody looking at a storm-tossed ocean and saying that this is beautiful rather than sublime. But that person would actually be seeing this as in harmony with, there is a harmony of the faculties which are brought in. Reason is not coming into play there. In the case of the beautiful, we know that the harmony is really between understanding, imagination, and sensibility. So it is, hypothetically, it is possible. Yeah, but Kant's point is that there are, like, imagine the stillness of the starry sky, that probably is more amenable to something like this.
Yeah, but I must give her the first choice. Yeah. Very small
I'll
question
keep it very
and quick answers. So
Thank you so
Nico
much,
can
sir.
answer.
Actually, this aligns so much with my presentation later today. So, on Sublime and the Critique of Judgment. So, I wanted to ask, because it has laid out the bigger picture of something that I'm going to zoom in on. And the idea is that why is that because of the moral sublime, and finally, like going to that category of the sublime, and the interpretations now, why is it that we go towards the political? Is it the reason that we give more importance to moral sublime as a subcategory of the single unified? I mean, why don't we leave, or why don't we not depart from that conceptualization? And also the fact that you later mentioned that why don't we actually take up not reason first, but something more fundamental that is hinted by Burke, of course, because I also discussed Burke, and then Kant taking up this German biologist Blumenbach's Bildungstrieb. So why is that really not taken into consideration, or maybe that can be taken into consideration to save us from this political reading of the aesthetic, the sublime,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Question.
Yeah, the reason why the critique of judgment was primarily read. I do not know in philosophy context, but certainly in literature and culture studies context, it was read for a long time as really establishing the initial grounds of modern aesthetics. Yeah. So, and one of the assumptions, at least what was seen as one of the assumptions of that formation, was its detachment from questions of politics. Like you are thinking about a form which is not made by force. Yeah. So force is somehow, harmony itself is a word for, you could say, thinking about that. But the more recent thinking about Kant has restored that, because people read this alongside not only the other two critiques, but also in relation to their anthropology work, the work on race, etc., etc. But that does not resolve the problem. It poses us a bigger challenge. How do we relate these two kinds of dimensions of Kant? That is really the question I was trying to approach, and I do not have an answer to that.
Thank you. Very good. Very good. Elaksh, last question, please. No, but there's...
Okay.
In order you come.
Thanks a lot. We have to soon break up for lunch. But just a very quick question, because I could not, kind of resist my temptation. I was thinking that we had been talking about rather going on with infinity, totality with respect to sublime. And of course, the question of, using unschematized categories like totality, infinity, you cannot do when, these are all unschematized categories which, the engager with the sublime is trying to put into. But what about infinitesimality? And suddenly I thought about that an analytic philosopher, like a logical atomist, like Russell and Tractarian Wittgenstein, are they, inherently, compellingly deprived from engaging with the sublime when they think that I cannot really bring up an elementary proposition? Really a genuine referrer, a logical proper name. But it will go on down to the infinitesimal, towards the ultimate, to the atomic facts. Yeah, could be.
Actually, it's a really...
Nirmalangshu's topic, yes.
Yeah, it's a really good point, because even in Burke, the infinitesimally small is a potential object of the sublime. It's actually the same thing. It's two different ends of a spectrum which go beyond the human ability to deal with. The infinitesimal is too minute, and the infinite is actually too large.
Mathematical sublime.
Yeah, exactly.
No, I think Anakshi's point is very sharp, that Kant's mathematical sublime seems to be ignoring that which is, thousandth part of the 100th part of the hair, of a hair edge, like in the Upanishads. Balagra shatabhagasya shatadha kalpitasya cha. So that's the description of, it's always sukshma, subtler and subtler and subtler. And that's, at least in the Indian tradition, that's the notion of the sublimely deep, rather than the vast. Right. And of course, ultimately, there is a unification of the vastest and the smallest. But before going that, what about in the mathematical sublime itself, the place of the infinitesimal in Kant? I think it's a very, very good omission that you have pointed out.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Arindam. Frankly, I don't remember the infinitesimally small in the third critique. Burke, very much. Burke, it's actually an important point. Yeah. For him, it's actually very similar. It's not like, it's symmetrical, you could say. But I did not think about this. The other question which one may want to think about is, in the dynamically sublime, you have the idea of might. Yeah?
Nature is a might.
Yeah. But then you have this idea of a stillness, which is actually not might. Yeah? So that again, the ocean, he says, if it is disturbed, it can overpower anything. But the whole point is that it's like a mirror. It's actually... So these moments are very, very interesting, I find. Yeah.
Thank you very much. A very interesting session so far. So we break for lunch. Thank you very much. काम तो और करना है after this discussion. Yes. See, it's a critique of enlightenment.
Hello. Please note that we have lunch being served in two different venues. Speakers, faculty, and presenters are requested to go for lunch in the research gallery. We have our volunteers on standby to help you in the process. All others, guests and all other attendees, you can please go for lunch in room number 12, where initially tea was served in the morning. Thank you. And please queue up and please try to maintain a queue. It will be served. And we come back for the next sessions in the same panel at 3 p.m. sharp. Thank you.